right, last time I said that we were going to work on conjunctions and oppositions in horoscopes. And what I have decided is to shift gears and go more slowly. After I reviewed all the things that we have to do, there is plenty of information that is philosophically foundational, but there's not a lot of astrology in it. And so I decided that, well, maybe we should look at more horoscopes, which really isn't astrology because we don't do astrology. We just make a few statements about this and that. And but we're going to do a lot more of that. Unfortunately, this means a lot more of preparation work for me. That we're going to, I'm going to have to look at a lot of things and work out a lot of different things. But the good part of it is that we get more appreciation of human character and how destiny works out and how astrology is shown in people's lives. Now, unless I state otherwise, what we're going to be doing in these sessions and in quite a few of the example sessions will not be analysis. I do have classes where we do analysis, and they're very long and very slow, and they go to quite a bit of depth. What we're trying to do is have familiarization. We're not trying to be comprehensive. We're not trying to state everything. Now, in these sessions, we're going to look at as many horoscopes as we have time for. And we want to have fun doing that, because astrology isn't fun, and it's, you don't want to do it. And when we look at these horoscopes, we're going to be looking for specific things. And when we look for specific things, we might miss the most important things in the horoscope, which would be very bad if we were trying to do a comprehensive analysis. To miss the most important thing, the most relatively significant thing, would be a horrible thing to do. But what we're looking for is not that. We're looking for just specific examples of what we have been studying. And so that's what we are going to do. So it's not really astrology, and it's merely trying to give some examples. Now, it is my nature, and I have the opportunity to, so sometimes it will not only be analysis, and will be examples. There might even be a few cheap shots along the way, or I mention a few curiosities, because I like doing that. All right. So this evening we're only going to be looking at conjunction horoscopes. And we said last time that the conjunction is abstractly ruled by Saturn and the Sun. And those are the two planets that rule the number 1. Saturn representing 1 point, and the Sun representing the totality, the entire universe. And so we're going to look at a lot of Saturn-Sun things and at conjunctions, just so we can get the feel of that, and not much more. All right, we're ready to begin here, I guess. Okay. All right, everybody sees that this is the horoscope of Mozart. Now, we said last time that one of the greatest attributions of the conjunction is concentration. The concentration that Mozart had was astounding concentration. And the example of Mozart is a good example from something that we find in modern mysticism. We relate to different worlds around us. Through our emotions, we relate to the desire world, and through our growth activities or energy, we relate to the etheric subdivision of the physical world, and with our minds, we relate to the world of thought. In spirit, we relate to higher transcendent realms. And it's only in the physical world that we relate to the physical world primarily through senses. We do experience every world that we are in, and we do have specialized means for experiencing them, though it is not really safe to call them senses, only because that gets confused then with the physical world. Now, when concentration is applied to sense perception in the dense physical world, we call that observation. When we pass into the etheric subdivision and actually see through the energies themselves and have something that's not really X-ray vision, but some people would like to call it that, we have etheric vision. And with etheric vision, we see energy and we see vitality and we see all sorts of things. For example, some people with etheric vision see people emanating all kinds of geometric figures, and they can't figure out what that is. And we know that after some observation that those geometric figures are the etheric structure that is behind the molecules that are being broken down and that we are sweating out. And so it's not necessarily that we are great mathematicians, it's that's what's happening. Now, when we gain control of our emotions and our desires, and we're able to focus them on various centers in our desire nature, we have desire world clairvoyance. And that desire world clairvoyance is called color vision. Because everything that is a desire appears like a color. When we have a certain kind of feeling, we emanate yellow. And if we see somebody where their aura is a bright red, we see somebody who is angry or very energetic. Whereas if it's a dark, dull red, almost approaching brown, you have somebody that has anger with hatred and things like that. So desire world clairvoyance is from a totally different world altogether. When we enter into our mind and penetrate into the world of thought with full consciousness, which is really thinking, we have what is called tonal vision, because thoughts are apperceived as tones. And with tonal vision, we can see things, or we can apperceive things that are millions of years old, because there's thoughts behind all the geology of the Earth and the astronomy, the solar system, and all of that. We pick up all of that. Now, there's actually a history of every thought that has been created. This is not the Akashic record. This is something much, much deeper than that and much, much better than that. So, if a person has tonal clairvoyance, they are, through the mind, perceiving and interacting with living thoughts. Because this relates to the solar system itself, which is made according to divine thought. Literally, people who have tonal vision sense the music of the spheres, or apperceive the music of the spheres. So, this is what Mozart was capable of. Mozart had tonal vision. He could hear an entire symphony, or he could hear an archetype, which is what you call a complex thought in the world of thought, in an instant of a second. And then he would have to bring it to this world and he would have to delineate that thought, and that was difficult. What he did is sometimes he would shake dice, and he would find patterns in the throws of the dice, or he would take a pool ball on a billiard table and he'd bounce it around, and he would get a feel of a pattern, and then that pattern he could use for taking that very integral thought form that he had brought down and sort of stretching it out, almost like pulling out individual strands of spaghetti out of a ball or something like that. All right, in this horoscope we have Virgo rising. And Virgo is one of the signs that is most acutely sensitive to pitch. The ruler of Virgo is Mercury. And Mercury is in that revolving conjunction with the Saturn and the Sun in the 5th house. So from this we see that it is not just concentration alone, but that it is mental concentration. And we see that it's in the 5th house, so that it is there for expression. But Aquarius is sort of a sign that likes to toy with notions of chanciness and randomness and things like that. And so the horoscope very exactly describes Mozart's consciousness in that way, because he had to use the pool balls for all of that. Now this is very interesting psychologically as well as it is astrologically and spiritually. Now this conjunction, the concentrating conjunction of Saturn, Sun, and Mercury, has no outside aspect, which means that it's isolated. And this means that, well, people who have this kind of conjunction sometimes have solipsistic attitudes of one kind or another. They think that the world doesn't exist except in their own thoughts and in their own personal experience. Now, there is one aspect, and that is an opposition to Neptune. So this is an opposition where what he gets from concentration, he projects. And he projects it outward, and he gets addicted to the psychological experience that comes from his concentration and the solving of it. Now he was, beside using pool balls and things like that to unwind archetypes, he was also a compulsive gambler. He would lose what in our time would be hundreds of thousands of dollars gambling, because he was addicted to that kind of thrill. This happens to all kinds of people. When you get a stage high and you come down, you can't stay there all the time. And so a lot of people who are performers get involved with drugs because they want to stay high in that way. Now, another way this works is it's hard telling whether he saw things in reality or whether he saw the opposite of things. This is always something that comes up when you have oppositions. With projection, you don't know whether you're seeing yourself or whether you're really seeing the other person. Some of the quality has to be in the other person for you to see them, but how much is there is a difficult matter. This is why psychological purity, which is something altogether different than moral purity, why psychological purity is so important in the spiritual path, so that you aren't projecting all the time and so that you can really see what's going on in people. There is a concept that Carl Jung has called enantiodroma. And by enantiodroma, when a person becomes too extreme, from deep within, the spirit projects the opposite of the extreme to produce some kind of balance so that a person doesn't get flung off on some kind of psychological tangent or something like that. And so this opposition of Neptune to the concentrated conjunction indicates that somewhere in the spirit there is an attempt to bring out chanciness as compensation for too great of a concentration. If he were to become too greatly concentrated, he would become insecure. And to some extent, that does take place. Now, there are 3 planets in this conjunction, and they each give a factor to the conjunction in a different way. Saturn represents patriarchy. It's like the grand old man. It's stern and rigid. It's a father figure. The Sun represents the spiritual creative father, the source of power, the shining light. In another sense, Pluto is the 3rd planet that indicates power, and that represents the divine spirit. It's not in this conjunction, but it's so we have 2 of the 3 planets of paternity here, and so what we have here is somebody that was controlled by his father, and had a certain amount of insecurity in that. Even Pluto has something to do with obsession through these squares of Pluto moon to the Uranus, but that's something else. All right, we won't spend this much time on all of them, but I just wanted to do at least one that we could get into something deeper. Yes, yes. There's evidence that the ancient people of India had a 12-planet system. This is Charles Baudelaire. Everybody knows who Charles Baudelaire is. He's the famous French poet who wrote a lovely book of poetry with a strange title because he was a stranger. There's some really delicate poems in it. There's some bizarre, dark ones also. But it's called Flowers of Evil. And this is in here to look at the father quality again. We want to carry on from where we left off with the last one. His father was an elapsed priest, and he died when Baudelaire was 6 years old. And so there is something missing in Baudelaire's life because he has this strange man as his father, the stepfather. And the stepfather was a military man, as we might expect with the Aries planets. And so the father said, this boy needs discipline, and he tried to apply military discipline to him. And what happened was, it was reaction. This happens very often with stepchildren. They don't accept the stepfather as the real father, and they rebel quite frequently again. In this case, the Saturn and the Sun meant concentration, but it meant something more than that. It meant a focus on negation. That's what the 8th house is all about. It's what's missing in life, what is absent in life. And the absence of his father, the not being of his father, led to a lot of negation. And so this man had a strange sense of denial about all sorts of things, but he was very much of a contradiction. He rebelled, and he went into all kinds of bohemian indulgence. Now we're looking at an early 19th century man, and he was dyeing his hair green. And he was a big contradiction. He believed in spiritual purity, but he liked to sleep with dirty street prostitutes who he treated sadistically. He was a Satanist and a Christian at the same time, and anything to deny anything. It was a strange sort of thing. Yes, sir.
Was it also reactionary because it was 8 house?
Somewhat, yes. Yes. So, in lieu of not having a father, he had to have a fixation somewhere. And if we look at that conjunction, it's square to the moon. And he had a very obvious Oedipal fixation on his mother. It was embarrassing to her, and it was embarrassing to everyone around. But she felt sorry for him because, he lost his daddy, and she sort of indulged him. I don't think she ever slept with him. But at any rate, he was sort of a fop. Jupiter, Venus are also in a conjunction, and he liked very rich clothing, and he was very much of a sensualist and went wild with things. And it's about enough to say, but it's just enough to show the conjunction as insecurity, and especially the conjunction as denial. Now, when we looked at the Saturn, at the conjunction mathematically, we said it was focused on one point of a circle. And that's another way of saying that the nature of the conjunction is one-pointedness. So let's look at a one-pointed person. Oh, okay. This is the horoscope of Celine Dion, who came from a Canadian-French family. She didn't speak any English until she was about 18 years old, and the only reason that she spoke English at all was to be able to sing bilingually, to be able to sing songs in English. Her father and mother had some kind of karaoke bar or something like that, and they retired from it, and they lived in poverty. I think they lived near the waterfront. I don't know if they had lived on a houseboat or anything like that. And the mother played the violin, and the father played the accordion, and what they didn't have for money, they had for love in the family. So they had song fests every week. At least once a week, the family would get together and sing. That makes a tough life go a lot easier. And in these song fests, she developed all her vocal abilities. This is somebody that has a 5-octave range. And for someone like me who has not even a 1-octave range, that's almost an unbelievable thing. Now, Saturn is a sign that is said to rule hermits. And Saturn, Sun, and conjunctions almost indicate that kind of hermit-like love of simplicity. Now, this is a person who is about as morally pure as can be. Unlike Baudelaire, she makes no compromises for any kind of indulgence. She became a star when she was 14, a world star. She started out in Europe, and one of the first things she did was give a lot of money. She bought her parents a mansion, and he gave her siblings hundreds of thousands of dollars because she knew what their life was, and she wanted to help it. This is not somebody who is a materialist, but she's one-pointed on being a success. And if that wasn't alone, she had a second father figure. She had a man who was her manager, the Saturn man who took control of everything in her life. He had her teeth all fixed up and taught her how to dress and everything else, and she was sort of a Pygmalion. And she was not really educated. He saw to it that here my notes, it says she was 21 before she started speaking English. And so he saw to it that she got education and made up for all of these things. This is the privation side of Sun Saturn. There is that love, that hermit-like love of moral purity, but there was privation. Eventually, at her instance, she fell in love with him and initiated when she became 18, she initiated a relationship with him. It's another side of Saturn's Sun, insecurity. And that's the side of the conjunction also. There's the insecurity because everything else is ignored, and when everything else is ignored and you're all alone, you feel somewhat insecure. With the single-pointedness was being reinforced by him, she was destined to become famous because she had only that one thing in mind and succeeding at that one thing in mind, and that's what she did. Now, sometimes Saturnine insecurity does not always lead to the kind of maturity. Saturn is the planet of age. Sometimes Saturn does not lead to maturity, and insecurity remains and actually becomes stronger. And there is something in this that there is isolation. That the more insecure someone becomes, the more isolated they become. And sometimes this represents a separation from others. And it certainly means a separation from universal love. And when that happens, it sets up all kinds of difficulties in terms of psychology. This is the horoscope of Mary Kay Letourneau. Now, if a person feels isolated, it doesn't matter whether there are other people around or not. This lady apparently had people. She was married, and she had 4 children. But because there's the mild Sun-Saturn conjunction, and Saturn is also conjoined to Mars, the planet of youth, which is in Saturn's sign, and the Sun is conjoined Venus. This is a very complicated chart. And all of these planets in this sort of funky kind of conjunction of running all the way from Mars to Venus and almost to Jupiter, it's complicated. All of those planets in one way or another, or some of each of them, aspects the Moon and Neptune in the west, in the 6th house. And so this is, I don't want to say that this is simple to understand. So it's a complicated horoscope. Now the conjunction is weak. And bringing in, since Saturn squares the Moon and the Sun, Venus square Neptune, it indicates all kinds of strange things. Now something like this, when you have 6 planets like this all in one aspect with varying strengths and varying qualities, the planet is called a complex. And when you have an astrological complex, it very often precipitates a psychological complex. Oh my goodness, I forgot to turn on my personal recorder. Yeah, well. This is a horoscope that is like that. It's also a horoscope of infamy and notoriety. The strong Sun-Venus conjunction indicates she sees herself as a being of love. where Saturn and Mars indicates, the conjunction of Saturn and the Sun indicates insecurity, and probably insecurity about aging. The Sun isn't really conjoined to Mars, but it gets its influence through the squares, and especially the Saturn and the Mars indicate frustration. Frustration and a desire for youth. The presence of the moon in all of this brings out a kind of mother problem in all of this, so it's not easy to say. The moon's on the cusp of the 7th, which is exactly square to Saturn. Now, when there are squares between the 10th house and the 7th house, or the west point at this point, the cusp of it, it means scandal. And in this case, there was scandal in spades. This lady was a teacher, and she initiated a sexual relationship with a 12-year-old boy. And after more than 200 instances of intercourse, she became pregnant by the little boy. And since the father had not been intimate with her, things started to come to light. And she was convicted of rape, and she was sent to prison for a 5-year sentence. And in prison, she gave birth to a little daughter, which was given to the boy's mother to raise. After a while, she was given a furlough for good behavior, because they didn't see her really as a criminal. But during the furlough, she surreptitiously got in touch with the boy again and again and got pregnant again. Had her second child in prison. And she eventually got out of prison because there's only so long they could keep her. And then she had cat and mouse meetings with him so that they could get together again and again. And when he turned 18, they got married. And for a while, they were estranged from each other. But to the best of my knowledge, I think they are still together and are still loving each other and are still doing very well. As it was said in the first time that we met, when you have both Saturn and Sun dealing with number 1, you have to deal with number 1 issues. Yes, sir. Yes, the Mars-Saturn. Yeah. Mars is the push-push side, and Saturn is the no-no side. But that isn't the only signature for bipolarity. So we're saying that Saturn and the Sun both rule the number 1. One being a specific one and the other being a general one, the universal one. For this reason, Saturn-Sun conjunctions often look out for number 1. All of the Saturn-Sun malefic aspects are often planets of aspects of selfishness. Sometimes even the benign aspects between Saturn and the Sun indicate selfishness. But selfishness is not always a bad thing. So this is the horoscope of someone where selfishness is a good thing. These are horoscopes that everybody knows all about these people. I have a penchant for people that nobody else knows anything about. This is the horoscope of the former Japanese imperial princess, Princess Nuri, the daughter of Akihito. Now, in Japan, a prince can marry a commoner and make royalty of her, which is what Akihito himself did. He made a precedent as being part of the imperial family, and he married a commoner, and she became empress. But a princess becomes a commoner from the day that she marries, unless she marries into high aristocracy, and even in sometimes then she becomes a commoner. This is, of course, a big disincentive to princesses. They get married. Let me stay home. And in the history of Imperial Japan, this is quite often what happened. The princesses stayed in the court because they were treated like royalty. They were pampered. And they became the maiden aunt that knew everything and became the wise woman to the rest of the people in the court. Now, at first, Princess Nuri tended to follow this path of least resistance, which is common to the Sun conjoined Saturn. This is a very strong Sun conjoined Saturn, less than half a degree, 20-some minutes. And so she at first wanted to take that course of least resistance, because Saturn Sun things are efficiency things. They like things to be efficient. As time went on, she became lonely in the palace, so to speak, and Saturn, Sun planets are lonely, especially the conjunction is lonely because it isolates and it separates. Now, in her loneliness, she absorbed herself increasingly in ornithology. In fact, she published a number of scientific papers on ornithology and is well recognized in that. And this is not the thing that a princess normally does, but as long as she was unmarried, she was still a princess. And eventually in this activity, she met an urban designer. And this urban designer did have some very distant ties to the aristocracy, but nonetheless was very much a commoner. And she married him. And she married him in order to pursue her own life and her own interests. This doesn't mean that she didn't love him, but she wanted to have her own life. She wanted to do her own things. And in Japan, this was considered a shocking break from tradition. Perhaps it was even a precedent to marry a commoner and give up the imperial status that she had. But her parents, Akihito and his wife, loved her very dearly, and they set their own precedent. They actually came to the marriage of their daughter to a commoner, which was unheard of. And so it had something came out very positive. So the question comes out of all of this, because, there are no cut and dried answers. Astrology gives us a way to get at answers, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what the answer is. That's up to us. In this case, the question is, what is selfish? Was it selfish to break from tradition, to become a professional bird watcher? Or was it selfish to live a life of tradition as a pampered prince? It's something interesting to ponder. You'd actually have to know the motivation or what kind of selfishness it was. There are positive forms of it, and there are some forms that are not positive. All right. Now, when we look at these horoscopes, we have a bias, because they're all horoscopes of famous people, or they wouldn't have made it into the database. A lot of astrologers put their own horoscopes in the database in hopes that they are going to become famous, or that they're rubbing elbows in a database with the famous people. You know, astrologers are not immune from vanity. But Saturn and Sun people are not always famous people, especially if there are malevolent Saturn-Sun people. Often they are unknown people because of the hardness of their life. They never make it out of poverty. Celine Dion had all that stuff in the 10th house, and she had destined herself for fame, but not everyone is able to do that. So, the Sun-Saturn in malefic experiences is very difficult. It usually gives somebody very little breathing room. Astrologers who are clairvoyants claim this is a pressure cooker aspect. It is used by the recording angels to help those who have been laggards in past lives. Because what happens is when there are Sun-Saturn aspects, a person gets no relief. No matter what, they have to work, and they have to work very hard. The Sun-Saturn in such a case works as an external conscience, because Sun-Saturn aspects are aspects of conscience. So, I couldn't find among famous people a horoscope of damned if you do and damned if you don't, but being damned you have to do something anyway. I couldn't find any of those, and I didn't want to go into personal horoscopes. So instead, I took someone who had both internal and external conscience, and tried to look at a horoscope of someone with conscience who eventually had conscience for the entirety of our society. Somebody with that deep Saturn basso voice, James Earl Jones. This is a relatively conscientious man. Saturn conjoins not only the Sun, but it conjoins Mercury. So this is a man, it's all in the first house. So this is a self-conscious person. Sun-Saturn people are always very self-conscious, but when they're in the first house, they are also personally self-conscious, not only inwardly, but outwardly. They're self-conscious about everything that happens around them. The planets also square Mercury, square Uranus. And the self-consciousness in him worked out in that he had a trouble talking, and when he did talk, he stuttered. And impediments of a stuttering variety are often associated with Uranus and Mercury. I have some of that. I've had it in the past. In recent years, I've gotten over it, but I've had some of these things. This is a man who had a Sun-Saturn combination that meant ambition. And he was conscientiously ambitious. And he wanted to become an actor. And the Sun in the first house, we've mentioned it before, is a self-made person. And Mercury in the first house is someone who starts young. And he started teaching himself when he was very young on his own, putting marbles in his mouth. And he put marbles in his mouth, and he not only overcame the stuttering, he would practice trying perfect elocution with a mouthful of marbles, which is something quite remarkable. Yeah, good line, I like it. So he did anything. Saturn and the Sun represent ambition. And he would do anything to fulfill his ambition. In order to get the money to go to New York or to audition for something, he would do anything from farm work to waxing floors. And he was humbled in this. Saturn's sun is, again, as we saw with the hermit, is a sign of being humble. And that certainly is the case in this case. Jupiter conjoins Pluto. And they are opposite, these conjunctions in the first house. And Pluto-Jupiter afflictions indicate prejudice. In the cardinal signs, active prejudice. So this is somebody who had to fight active prejudice every step of the way. But because he was conscientious and because he persevered, he did what he did until he became famous. And he is the conscience of the United States in many ways. Beside being the voice of Darth Vader, he is also does all of these public service announcements, and every time they want to trot somebody out who is speaks with authority and conscience, they call on James Earl Jones. All right, Saturn indicates limitation. And with the sun, it indicates a self-limitation. May be uncomfortable, but it has benefits, and those benefits go beyond humbling. It indicates the sun or the self isn't splashed all over the place. It is held in bound by limitation. And that is another way of saying that the spiritual creativity of the sun is brought to efficiency. This is a horoscope of an efficiency person. This is a classic, obvious horoscope. So easy, child's play kind of horoscope. It is efficiency in communication in the third house. Sir Isaac Pitman was the man who developed shorthand. It's evolved some since his time, but basically the shorthand that he did was so efficient and so accurate that it has stood for a very, very long time. Now, there's not much more we can say about the horoscope. We don't have to say a whole lot about all of them. It's just to say that this indicates specialization. Specialization into a language that only people who need very fast, efficient, quick ways to communicate it's for them. It's that kind of a horoscope. Now, there's one interesting feature about this horoscope, about this life, that I don't know where to find it in the horoscope. I would guess it comes from the Venus conjoined to Neptune, which indicates a very spiritual tender-heartedness. But Sir Isaac Pitman was a vegetarian. Boy, we're going through a lot of them, aren't we? Now, if we bring something to a point, whether we do it from ambition or whether we do it from insecurity, we know exactly where it's at. Saturn, Sun people are sometimes manipulators, and they manipulate because they can get the results that they want. And when they get the results that they want, they're secure because they know why they are that way, because they made them that way. It's not everybody that is like Mozart that carries that so far that it needs to be compensated with taking chances or gambling or things like that. So the Sun conjoined Saturn, especially the conjunction in general, is all about bringing something to a point. It is about accuracy. If we are accurate, we are automatically efficient. But in order to be accurate, sometimes we have to specialize. And the conjunction, probably more than any other aspect, is the aspect of specialization. Saturn conjunctions are also even more so specializing. Saturn, Sun aren't necessarily so, but often are. But there's always some kind of a special niche that one gets into. So we have a horoscope of accuracy. For some reason, the family of Annie Oakley did not have a father around. Again, this is one of those cases that the two planets that represent the father have to be considered in one way malefic, because she didn't have a father, which makes it difficult for someone. She was the oldest, which is another Saturn-Sun thing. She had to be conscientious and she had to support the family. She did it in a most unusual way. She went out and hunted game and put naked on the table by hunting from a very early age. And in the process, she developed phenomenal marksmanship. She did all those miraculous things like hitting a card on edge and doing things like that. Eventually, at 15, she had enough of bringing up the family, and I don't know if it was good selfishness or bad selfishness, but she ran away from home. And she got into shooting circles, and she married her husband, who was a professional shooter, and he was older than her, so that insecurity worked out that way, and the Saturn-Sun again became a father person, and he became her manager, and of course she went on to the Wild West show and all of that. Besides being a shooter, an excellent shooter, she was a very tough woman. The Saturn-Sun can be like that. It can be leather tough. Now let's shift gears a little bit and look at another side leading on from Annie Oakley, and that is attitude. Saturn-Sun has a cool, ice-cold attitude about it. What is it called? I don't know how to pronounce it. Lulu's going to have to help me. Sang-froid?
What language is it?
French. It's spelled sang-froid, but it's called sang-froid. Yeah, cold-bloodedness. All right. You're supposed to know all the languages and everything for me. I call on you. Julie, you never had any French either, did you? Huh? Okay. Oops. All right. So we want to look at cold-bloodedness. I happen to like basketball, so during the course of the years that we go through this course, you're going to see a number of basketball players, probably. This is the horoscope of somebody who is a very cold, tough man. And he isn't cold and tough just because of Scorpio rising, but that is a big part of it. He's cool-headed. He's probably the best clutch player in the entire NBA. He's not very well liked. Scorpio rising people aren't always well liked, and having Uranus in the first house, he probably grates on people. And the opposition of Uranus to the ascendant and to Uranus makes it even more unpleasant. People probably have some kind of unconscious feeling of horror around him. Yeah. The moon, yeah. The Uranus nature is, the Virgo nature. Sun is conjoined to Saturn in Virgo, which is probably the most studious of all of the signs of the zodiac. And I don't like Kobe Bryant, but I have a great respect and a great admiration for him, not only for his talent, but for his professionalism. This is a consummate professional. He has studied footage of every great basketball player that there is, and in minute detail, in slow motion, all of the great moves that they made. He has studied them and what went into them to make those moves successful, and he tries to take them into his own game. In the off season, a lot of basketball players like to get into trouble and things like that. He goes and he has special coaches for shooting and special coaches for, and he is a constant 365 days a year person. He is a professional, but he's got that cold nature about him. Of course, everybody wants to know, all the women want to know, was that just a publicity thing by the girl, or is he really a rapist? And the Pluto conjoined Venus and Mars in the mix says pretty likely that he was a rapist, or what he might call forceful sex. I'll just bring up another call. I'm not going to say anything about this chart, but just to bring it up for Jerry's sake. Another cold-blooded person. Jerry's a Yankees fan, and this is the horoscope of Derek Jeter. Another very cool customer. Not only the Sun conjoined Saturn, but you have the Moon conjoined Pluto in the ascendant, and both of them are very, very cool. He's been in the press just recently. I didn't look it up in his horoscope when he was in the press, but he was batting, and he was in his stance, and there was a ball that came in very close, and it hit the tip of his bat. You know, he was holding the bat like that, and the ball hit the tip of his bat, but he went, oh, like he was hurt. And he got a base for being struck by the ball, and he wasn't struck by the ball, and it was very clear when they showed all of the playback, but he got on base, and he was interviewed later on. He says, "You call that cheating?" He says, "My job is to get on base." All right. While we're looking at cool attitudes, we have to look at a cool attitude that probably everybody knows. Oops, all right. Humphrey Bogart. This is somebody that is a cool customer, at least in image. And image is an important thing here because Neptune is in the first house. A few years ago, we looked into the horoscope of Michael Jackson, and he had his whole image manipulated with Neptune in the first house. He was uncomfortable with his image, which is indicated by the Saturn opposite Neptune. The Sun is roughly opposite Neptune, and the more uncomfortable he became with his image, the stronger his image became. He became basically typecast as being the cool, tough kind of guy. And the more he became typecast, the more he was uncomfortable with the image. Sun opposite Neptune would indicate an uncomfortableness with image, and so he became depressed. The Saturn opposite Neptune is a very clear sign of depression. And he dealt with his depression with cigars and alcohol. When he met Lauren Bacall, he was deeply involved in alcoholism, and he fell in love with her and came out of it. But even though he has the moon in the fifth house, He was not a good father. He could never warm up to his children. He was always cold, and with his always coldness, even had some animosity toward children. You know, when you're in love with somebody, you want to be in love with them, not necessarily those little brats that come along. Well, I gotta state what. Yes, yeah, insecure about leaving. So you can see he was uncertain about his marriage and uncertain about his image quite a bit. But he was cool, and the world saw him as cool. Now, Saturn is sometimes the planet of fate and of destiny. If you think about it, our every thought, our every emotion, our every action is recorded. It is recorded within our own being, and it eventually gets worked out in justice through the process of cause and consequence. And when we think of justice in terms of cause and consequence, we have a legalistic view of justice rather than a Jupiterian view, which is you learn the lesson, you don't have to do a tit for a tat, and it doesn't have to be right down to the last detail. In this case, we have, with Saturn and the Sun, we have a punctilious kind of legalistic kind of view that is in conflict with the forgiving and generous judge. The horoscope of Errol Stanley Gardner. This is the detective writer who created the very famous character Perry Mason. Perry Mason was a defense attorney who always found a way to beat the DA and made the DA come off as a villain. He usually did this by finding some obscure clue or some obscure detail, which is just exactly what you would expect with Sun and Saturn. It is paying attention to some little detail and getting justice because of it. Sometimes he called on obscure points of the law. It was the same kind of thing. With the Sun and Saturn, you look for obscure little-known things, whether it is a hermit hiding in the woods being an obscure little unknown person, or whether it is something in the law books that nobody looks at. Now, in this horoscope, it's not really clear where Perry Mason stands with regard to justice, because the two planets of justice, Saturn and Jupiter, are in the square. Saturn squares Jupiter, Sun squares Jupiter. So he sees both the positive and the negative sides of both. He obviously, especially when he was writing, he didn't want to undo the authority of the district attorney or anything like that, but he seems to be confused. He doesn't really know. If you look at what he's famous for the 10th house, and those planets in the 10th house are square to Venus. And Venus square the moon indicates somewhat taking liberties with things. They're both in the literary signs, Gemini and Virgo, taking romantic liberties with the truth in order to be entertaining. And his stories certainly were entertaining, though it's not clear where he stood on the matter of justice ultimately. What?
Question on that?
Yeah.
The thought occurred to me that in that case, and having watched a lot of Perry Mason, the justice dealt a lot, seemed to deal more with the earth type of justice.
Yes, that's the Saturn side.
And how materialists would look at it, not so much how the law looks at it, just how the universe might look at the justice.
Yes, that's correct. Jupiter would be more forgiving. Jupiter would say we've got to look at the big picture of it all. All right. Kobe Bryant, to use him as an example, is famous for doing whatever it takes to win games. Even though he's the best clutch player in the NBA, he doesn't always take the final shot. If it requires somebody who doesn't even often take shots, he will dish it off to that person if that person is wide open. And for this reason, he gets the trust of other people. But he has that quality of doing what it takes to win. Saturn and Capricorn, you remember from the very introductory course, Saturn and Capricorn rule roaches and rats. And they are survivors, and they do whatever it takes to survive. And they have survived over millions of years. In some cases, not even a whole lot unchanged. So, together, what we have seen, the basic existence of something is survival. Often, Sun conjunct Saturn indicates a very tough life and a life that is for survival, and the person has to knuckle down if it is a conscience-building aspect that we said before. This is the horoscope of a survivor. We don't know what her early life was like. She was raised in Dutch Indonesia, and even though she's written 19 books, she doesn't tell what her early life was like. In her profession, you don't ever tell what it is like. No doubt, her early life with the Saturn and Sun in the first house, it was very hard life, and she did whatever was necessary to survive. Does everybody know who Xaviera Hollander is? I guess you're of a different generation. Xaviera Hollander was famously known to the world as the happy hooker. She was a high-class international prostitute, and she was renowned as a prostitute that people would pay very, very high money to be with her. And she wrote the book called The Happy Hooker. It's not clear that she was a happy hooker. You look at the horoscope, there's nothing really sensual in the horoscope. There's a wide trine between Mars and Venus, which indicates some kind of passion, but it's positive and it's in the fiery signs. There's not much in earthy signs. Jupiter isn't messed up in such a way that it would indicate sensualism, so it is not clear. But Uranus squares the planets in the third house, and especially Uranus square Venus is romanticism. And for the sake of writing, for the sake of writing, she made it romantic. And she romanticized her life as a professional, even though she may not have been a happy hooker. Probably she sold many millions of copies. You sell more books if you're writing as a happy hooker than as an unhappy hooker. Obvious that it would be that way.
I think the moon in Scorpio square to Jupiter, square to the Pluto-Venus have to do with having a lot of sexual experiences and then being...
It could be multiple experiences, but I don't think that it's sensualism. I have only one thing I'm going to say about that. And I'm coming to that in a little bit. All right. With Uranus rising, she knew the tricks of the trade and was clever and adaptable, and she was skilled as a writer. In fact, in the data bank, she is listed as a writer and not as a prostitute, because that's where she really made her splash in the world. Then she retired, and after she retired, she allowed her weight to go up to 200 pounds, and she felt she owed it to herself. She has these days, she does not have much for male lovers. She has the moon, the Pluto-Venus moon is a combination that indicates her lesbian preference. She has lesbian lovers, and that combination is quite strong that way. And it also indicates that she likes to have the obsession with power. And she does have, when she's on the beach at Cannes, she has a submissive on a leash that she takes along with her. All right. Now, Saturn conjoined the Sun also indicates other attitudes besides cold attitudes and clutch performance and all of that. As we have said, Saturn and the Sun in a conjunction, the conjunction always indicates the beginning and the end of the cycle. If it's at the end of the cycle, there's something of an attitude of time and history about it. In some cases, it's a matter of grave tradition, talking about the past. And so it can be timid with regard to the past, or it can be overpowered by the past, or it can be seasoned. Let's look at this horoscope. Everybody knows who this is, I'm sure. This is the horoscope of the founder, co-founder with her husband of the Church Universal and Triumphant. There is, it's something like a mystery teaching, except that it's very highly for profit and it's very much an in thing. It at first was called the Summit Lighthouse until it got a bad reputation, and then it called itself the Church Universal and Triumphant. They are now headquartered in Montana in a bunker. That when everything all comes down, they're going to come out and rule it all. The Church Universal and Triumphant is a second or third generation spin-off from the Rosicrucian Fellowship. Off of the Rosicrucian Fellowship, the first spin-off was something called the I Am Society. And the I Am Society made its big splash, but it also became very financially oriented. And then off of the I Am Society, Summit Lighthouse. When she became the head of it, her husband died at a very early age, at about 52 years old. It was a $30 million concern, and they had their headquarters in Malibu. Why not? This is not the hermit like Scorpio. This is not somebody who, like Celine Dion, will live on almost nothing. She claims to be a channel for the Ascended Masters, and claimed to do so even though she was quite far into Alzheimer's. She was tough, that's for certain, and she knew how to turn a dollar. And she knew how to be that tough manager that kept people under control. Very clear. But that's not why we're looking at this horoscope. We're looking at this horoscope because she knew how to be the grand old dame. She could pose herself within tradition, the tradition of the ascended masters and the tradition of mysteries teachings in the United States. She felt an error to all of those things. And she could do this with great charm, and a very careful charm, with the Venus trined Pluto in the first house. Indicates that she's a power in the world. And because she had this power, and because she could play the grand old Saturnian person, she was affectionately known as Guru Ma. I had a chance to see her in town once here. She came and gave a multi-hour lecture, about an 8-hour lecture with little breaks in between. But I was fed up with her by that time, and I didn't care to see her. No. There is in every human being, but not a great deal. Now, at the beginning or the end of a cycle, I should put that back up for 1 second. This is oops. Reading in the ethers, are you, huh? This is a end of a cycle. The sun is coming back home to Saturn, meaning he's at the end of things. We're going to go into that a great deal. In fact, we're going to spend many hours looking at many horoscopes doing that. So, at the end of a cycle, or especially right at that point where it is neither beginning nor end, where it's exact, is where there are piercing, penetrating breakthroughs. So the Sun conjoined Saturn, or the conjunction in general, is the aspect of breakthroughs. And so we would expect to find at least one famous person for breakthroughs, and we find one person that is famous for many, many breakthroughs. Yeah. It's not the most planets I've seen in Taurus. I've seen all but one planet in Taurus. This is the horoscope of a man who made not only one, but many, many breakthroughs. He started out as a shipbuilder in the Second World War, and he made a breakthrough in shipbuilding in that he took Henry Ford's assembly line idea of building automobiles and applied it to ships. And he became interested in building other such things, such as planes and autos. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a Kaiser automobile. I'm old enough to have seen one. Lou, have you seen one? Oh, you did? Okay. He couldn't buck Detroit, and so it didn't last long. When he became interested in planes, he became interested in what were then more exotic materials, and he got involved with aluminum and magnesium and all sorts of things like that. This is a materials horoscope, as you would expect with Taurus. He was interested in the stuff, and he had an uncanny ability to understand stuff. Uranus is in the second house, which is the house of stuff, and it trines all of those planets up there, the conjunction in Taurus. So he has an amazing ability to understand the nature of stuff and how it's going to work. And he always did new things. He did new things by starting building materials with permanente. First person to do that. And when he built those buildings, he said, well, I can make money on this in a way that was also unknown before he made the breakthrough. He's sort of the father of condominiums. And the one thing that I think Kaiser Aluminum is still on the stock market, isn't it? It was Kaiser Industries at that time. There's one thing that he started that is still very big, and everybody that belongs to it swears by it. Henry Kaiser is the father of the HMO, of the Kaiser plant. So if we look at this one, the Sun is on the other side of Saturn. So this is at the beginning of things. So that's just what we would expect at the beginning of the cycle. So it's something new. And so this is something that we see with this kind of conjunction. Now the last horoscope we're putting up just for fun. We always have to have one just for fun. At the beginning of a cycle, the ground has to be cleared. Or at the change of the cycle, when something new is going to be coming in, the ground has to be cleared. And this, of course, is another aspect of the cold, barren Sun Saturn. So Humphrey Bogart didn't like his children. He didn't hate them or anything like that, but didn't really get on well with them. So it has that cold quality about him. This is somebody who had probably had a cold quality about everyone. The horoscope is very questionable and very controversial, to say the least. It comes from a Persian who said that on this date of birth that there was going to be a terrible storm that was going to sweep across the entirety of Europe and Asia, and indeed it did. This is a fun horoscope to look at. That's the horoscope of, supposedly, of Genghis Khan. He had a remarkable life. This is when you might want to, this is when you might be able to tell whether it's true or not by looking at all the different systems of directions. When he was 13 years old, he took over the tribe. And he united all the Mongolian tribes. And within 50 years, he, his son, and his grandson had conquered the world. Everything from the Pacific to Europe. And they did it all with little shaggy Mongolian horses and with little arc-short bows. And those horses were so tough from living in the steppe that they could go for miles and miles. And what he did is he would have surprise attacks from distances that nobody would ever expect. And they just overpowered and decimated everything. This is a partile conjunction almost. So this is right at the very beginning of the cycle.
With all that labor, wouldn't his love of nature be...
No. Libra is not necessarily always lovey. Libra can very well be tough. John Kennedy played poker with Khrushchev, faced him off over Cuba. It was not a gentle, mild Libra thing. Often Libra is like that, but not always. You may be a lovey-dovey Libra-like person, but not everyone. All right, any questions about any of it? Yeah. Well, it's just such a, everything is associated with everything. I don't know what to say on it. When everything is in one big revolving conjunction like that, it's hard to read. It's very hard to read. All right. Thank you very much.